Hi, and welcome to the first Austin Software Cooperative 2021. Today, we are going to discuss The Democratic Worker-Run Firm by David Ellerman, specifically Chapter 1. It's a pretty dense book, so we'll probably break this up. Watson has created a mind map for Chapter 1. We're going to dive into that. Go over the different items in there, have any open discussion, and look at the next co-op meetup on February 3rd. Watson, are you ready?
Yeah, thanks. Right. Let's jump right in here. So we normally go over the whole book and just force our way through, but this book has so many things that answers a lot of questions that come up all the time for us. So I decided to really dive into the first chapter, and then we'll just have a part 2 or part 3 for the next 2 chapters. And I think that'll help us. This book doesn't have a digital copy, or I couldn't find a digital copy, and it doesn't have an audio. So this was just regular old school highlighting. So hopefully I'll share this mind map and I'll add to this for the other chapters when we get there. So the forward, they just let you know right from the beginning. We're going to be talking about private property, free markets, entrepreneurship, and economic democracy is not the employer-employee relationship. That's kind of really what is trying to be communicated in this book. There's I guess a belief that cooperatives mean that you lose these three here, and the argument is that you do not. So here we go into this introduction. Make this a little bigger. I'm gonna try to concentrate a bit on some of the things that I want to tease out, but also the thought experiments that he has. I think that they help to illustrate some of the concepts. So we've got a definition of a democratic firm. They're owned and controlled by the people who are working. It's very similar to a democratic government. It's owned and controlled by the people who live in the geographical area. Very simple. One person, one vote. And if you work, you're a member. All right. So now their reoccurring problem when talking about these things is when you're talking about capitalism or socialism or communism or some other type of economy, like how do you define it? Well, what Ellerman does is say, okay, if you have a market economy, you can kind of define the economy based off of how many people or how many firms are in a certain structure. So if you have a market economy where most firms are democratic firms, right? So ones that have fulfill these options up here, then that would be an economic democracy. Here's some democratic principles. The let's say capitalism, there would be, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but a definition of capitalism is that it's a private property, market economy and entrepreneurship, I don't have on here, and then the employer-employee relation. The only difference between an economic democracy and a capitalistic democracy, or I'm sorry, capitalistic economy, is you subtract this employer-employee relation. So you still have the private property, you still have market economy, and you still have entrepreneurship. Right. So those are here. One of the things that we're going to jump into more is talking about labor, the labor market. And one of the problems is with the labor market is that the workers basically are treated. It's a reoccurring theme is people being treated as things, or people being treated as tools. So the services of the worker are treated like hours, or are treated as a rent, like as if you would, like how you would rent a car. And so he's going to try to tease out the philosophical argument. Um, so based on theories of property, so on and so forth, where you try to argue against this idea of workers as a rentable asset. Now, this is an issue I always find irritating when you're talking about capitalism is not precisely defined. There's many different, some people just think capitalism, that's the good thing. That's what capitalism means. It's the good thing. You know, it's the moral thing or something like that. If you don't do that, then you are going to live in some authoritarian, um, government or something. But on that's one side of the spectrum. Another side could be, trying to really define it. We were going through here. It's really a cluster concept of institutions. So, how it is that you get organized, private property, free markets, entrepreneurship, and this employer-employee relation. Right. So that's the working definition of capitalism in this book. Okay. Democracy, you're not going to have that employer-employee relationship. And another name for that would be the master-servant relationship. So the main critique, again, is not really of capitalism as a whole. It's not of free markets. It's not of entrepreneurship. It's not of private property. All of that stuff is really the rhetoric of socialism versus capitalism. So this book is not, it's going to talk about that discussion, but it's trying to distance itself from that discussion. Is there any questions so far? Because I'm going to speed up a bit. All right. Let's skip over here. We have a definition of socialism. This is a hot button issue. An American definition of socialism, it's really state socialism. So the government is the one that controls the means of production. So how it is that products get produced, the government has some kind of say or owns it. In Europe, there's more connotations of just self-management. So that's kind of more what we're talking about here, where it's worker-owned groups and things. So you have self-management socialism and private employment socialism. The critique, Ellerman says, is just don't use the word, just use economic democracy instead, because people it's not good rhetoric. That might be true. I don't go around talking about socialism, so. All right, so here's the approach of the book. Philosophical first principles, legal theory that's going to support or be based on some of those first principles, and then financial structure. Probably not going to get to that today. And let's see here. We've got I don't know if you guys are familiar with ethical philosophy, but you've got the descriptive versus the prescriptive, right? So on the descriptive, you're just describing actually, another phrase for it is de facto, how the world actually is. So we're going to be describing property rights, capital production, and governance rights in the capital firm. Then you're going to go to prescriptive. So you're going to talk about labor theory of property, democratic firms. So we're saying that, oh, we ought to do this, right? So descriptive is what is, and prescriptive is the ought. So this is a is ought dichotomy here. And then you've got democratic theory based on self-determination, and we're going to talk about legal structure. And that is the intro. You can kind of get a really good overview of the book in that intro and kind of know where he's going. The arguments are teased out. Do you have any questions so far? All right, we're going to go. All right, overview of this first chapter. We're only going to do this first chapter. You can see there's a bunch of different pathways that we could go and drill into. So democratic theory, inalienable rights, humanism, rationalist thought, and the Enlightenment, which the rationalist thought is coming from there. That's kind of where we're drawing for some of the power for some of these arguments. Some first principles that this is going to be a recurring thing. People should have the right to the fruits of their labor, or they have the right of the fruits of their labor. It's an inalienable right. And whenever we don't have that, there's something wrong with the world. And then democratic self-determination. So from here, this is kind of the driver for what we're going to talk about. Now, let's talk about this fundamental myth of private property. So this is going to start talking about some of our intuitions, especially for Americans, on how we think about work and what's fair, and some of the things that we talk about in this group a bunch. So we have a fundamental myth here, right? So there's the battle between socialists and capitalists on the firm, the owner of the property rights, and the owner of the means of production, right? So the capitalist firm, we have these two concepts right here. Capital owner role, so that's the person you can just think of, they own the tool, the widget maker, right? Maybe they own the windmill or something like that. And then the residual claimant role. So this person owns what you could call the surplus, you could call it the profit, you could call it the income, you could call it that space of whatever it is that's between after you paid everyone off and then you sold the widget, that price, that profit, who is it that gets to say where that goes? That's the residual claimant role, right? So capital owner, they own the means of production. What is that? Like I said, the windmill to grind corn. Residual claimant, they bear the cost of inputs and they own the produced outputs, right? So the myth is the residual claimant role is part of the property rights of the capital owner's role. That is the fundamental myth that Ellerman is saying that we've all swallowed hook, line, and sinker. Right. So here's a thought experiment. Let's say, then he uses an example later on, but let's say you have you rent out the capital asset. So you have a widget maker, right? You have a windmill. If you rent that windmill out, you lease it out, and someone else uses it to grind their corn. Do you own the means of production, so you leased it to someone else. Do you have the residual claimant role? Can you say, I also want to own that corn you produce or grind it or whatever? And the answer is no, right? The leasee is the one that owns that corn. So that's going to be an argument that's used over and over again. That we're going to it's these two roles, capital owner role and residual claimant role, they're bundled together, and that they should be unbundled. And an argument that we accept all the time is you can lease capital assets. All right, so that's going to come. We're going to talk about that more. All right. Another thing. So one thing that comes up where is okay, the person that kind of set everything up, organized the corporation, and they own the widget maker, they hired everyone, whatever. They if they when they lease the bargaining, when they lease the capital assets, right? So lease the windmill, the bargaining power changes, right? One of the things that people kind of will think about, say, entrepreneurship and the person that owns everything is that there's some kind of, because they set everything up and they owned everything and they took the risks and stuff, that there's some type of fairness or sacred right of private property, right? And but that whole lease argument kind of blows that up. Like you can think of an example where someone leases out the assets, like what we did, and they don't. There isn't a sacred right that was violated. It was still fair. They decided to lease it out, and it was fine. So it's really what he's trying to say is we're going to put that under a contractual type relationship or role. It's really this voluntary, an agreement thing, and it's not a inalienable fundamental right type thing. Any questions so far? All right. I'm going to do, here's another thought experiment here to try to tease this out a little bit more. Contract reversal. So you can have a situation where, let's just think of a warehouse, right? So they have the owner, they bought the warehouse, they hired some workers, and everything's going fine. Well, let's say that, times are getting hard, they're not showing a good profit, they might close the business down. Well, the workers could get together and say, hey, well, we'll just lease the warehouse from you and let us do our own thing, whatever it is that we do. But we'll lease it from you, and then we're gonna, decide what to charge and do whatever else for the profit for the products. There's really no problem with that, right? So you have a distressed company, and they no longer want to be the residual claimant, right? They're like, oh, I just want to lease this stuff out, blow it up, lease it out. There's really it's not really sacrilegious or anything like that. There's no ethical problem there. Well, so that would be that helping you to separate in your mind the residual claimant from the it's a sacred right of the person that is the one that owns the capital. There's also the reverse example where, so a lot of times the gas stations, they're owned by the oil companies or the equipment is, and then they lease all of that to independent contractors, and then they worked the gas station. And this is actually a real example. So during the 70s, you had the oil embargo. There were hard times that came. Well, and this is a reverse example. The independent contractors and the oil companies, they had a situation where the oil company said, well, now we don't want to buy you out. We just want to hire you. So now you used to be the residual claimant. Basically, you used to be able to sell for gas for the highest price you wanted, charge whatever you wanted, and you're the residual claimant. We want to stop that. And we want to now be the residual claimant. So that's a reverse situation. Still valid, and it's legal and all that stuff. So this is beginning to tease out this fundamental myth of private property. Do you guys kind of seeing it, or we're going to talk about some more? But
I think I'm understanding what you're saying, but I'm not hearing like where is a specific problem. Can you outline like a specific claim that's we're saying is not right, like tying back to a myth or someone who's exploitation or whatever, and where the problem is in any of those thought experiments?
Yeah, so you have the entrepreneur. Let's use software, I guess. You have someone that sets up the company, hires some programmers, right? And they say, okay, create this software. It's going to be closed source, right? And you're paying the programmers nice salary. And there's something that it seems like, because the person that, and it's just, this is a cultural thing, but it seems like because the person that started the idea, and they, legally they could have had you sign a bunch of things as far as copyright or whatever it is, non-competes and all that. But it seems like even if they didn't have you sign all that stuff, it seems like when you're done and he or she turns around, you created software, and he or she turns around and says, now I'm going to sell this software for, it costs me $1 million to make, but I'm going to sell it for $100 million. And, that 99 million, that's mine. You're not getting any bonus. You're getting whatever I feel like giving you, but it probably be nothing. So that seems completely fine and fair, or does it not seem like it's fine and fair to you?
Like it's like a risk on each person's part, because there's no telling ahead of time how much it'll be. But even if you got like 1% of your compensation in stock, then if it balloons, like in that example, that could like essentially double your pay.
Yeah, they could do some type of profit sharing, that kind of thing, and try to ease some of that. But that profit that's being sent out, or I'm sorry, claimed by the person that set it all up, what Taylor was saying is there, what's wrong? Like, so what's being said here that should be controversial, is that it isn't a ethical thing where the person that set everything up in the beginning and took what you said, took the risks. You kind of had an intuition there of, oh, the person that took the risk, they should be the one that gets the big reward at the end. So, and in our society, we have this idea of an entrepreneur. They took the risk. You kind of didn't really take any risk. You just took a job. You can get another job, that kind of thing. Maybe they had more capital assets. Maybe they took out a loan in order to handle payroll for the first couple months, something. And so you shouldn't really have any say about where that profit goes. Maybe they were gracious enough to give you a couple pieces of stock or something like that. But you're not going to have any say about where that profit goes. You know, they could
I guess,
decide to reinvest it. So even if you have stock, the person can reinvest the stock and you don't get to say anything. They could have, they can not send any dividends out at all. You don't get to say anything, right? Those types of things. And that's really, as far as the decision on where the profit goes, that's really what the discussion is here. And they're saying that actually that's merely and only a contract situation. It has nothing to do with ethical. The idea of, well, they took the risk. They're saying, nope, that is not. Someone can be compensated for the risk based off of you decided to, like you say, let's put it like this. You take on the risk of buying a windmill, right? And you're not going to grind any corn. You're just going to lease it out. Well, people are just going to pay you the amount that it is to lease the windmill. And that's the only value that you have. You don't get to have the right to say where the profit goes for the corn that they mill, that they grind. And so that's really the controversial thing that's being talked about here. Does it make sense, Taylor?
Yeah, so maybe to take that further, and I'll just go with the one that you're saying, the windmill. So, and put risk on it. So you are going to buy a windmill, which you can do right now for, say, power or whatever. You're buying a big windmill and you think it's going to be profitable, so you're taking the risk. You actually take a loan against your house, and if it's not, then you could lose your house, right? So you're like a real risk. And then you have someone else that's grinding the grain or whatever, renting, like you're saying, to grind the grain. And now instead of saying you can pay me however much per hour or whatever it is, instead you say, I want 20% of all profit that you make. That would still be set. You're putting down, here is how much I want to pay, and someone could walk away.
Yes. Now that is like skipping to the end of the chapter. It's like that's a royalty payment, and that still would be, you don't have residual claimant role. Right. That was an agreement that was made right from the beginning, right? So it's still something that would be within the bounds of an economic democracy and not a.
And I guess if to make it further into like tying it into not just you're renting, because part of the thought experience was you start a software business, but we could do it with windmill. So you start you put up the capital to have a building built, have the windmill built, all the tools. So you have all of that. And then you hire people and you're paying the salary and whatever, all of the things. So now you started the company. This could have been a software company where you did the same thing with brick and mortar and, whatever, train people to write the software if you want. But you train people to in this place with the windmill, and now they are grinding flour and whatever, all the things that you're producing out of it. And you put up the risk, whatever that is. And maybe it's literally like you loans against your house and property if you want to actually put a higher risk. And now there's people in there that are working and they're doing all the labor. So now they're the ones doing the labor and day to day, and you're running this thing for years. So it's like a large 100 people, big operation. And you aren't doing any more labor. You set it all up. But you now are saying, I'm going to take 90% of the profit. I pay y'all to do the labor, but I'm going to take 90% of the profit. What I set the prices for how much we sell it. Y'all do the labor, and I pay you for doing your labor.
Yeah, once you said I set the prices, then it's broken.
That's right. I'm putting it out there like that. So tied.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make it real with something that I could see to tie it in with how what this book is talking about. So
Yeah. So once you said you're the one setting the prices, you're the one that's the residual claimant. Someone else, like you did a royalty payment, let's say, if you did it off percentages, that's one thing, and that could be, like you said, the 90%, that might be a borderline thing. Like if somebody said, I'm taking 100% of the profit. Well, that's basically the same thing as what the employee-employer relationship and residual, you have the residual claimant role at that point. If you're taking 100% of the profit, right? You take 90%, But if it's a royalty payment, as in, well, the widgets right now are worth $10 and we're going to pay you $2, and then that's great right now. And then 5 years from now, it went up to $100, but we're still only paying you $2. That's kind of more along the lines of where this thing's going, I think. But yeah, it's kind of, if you wanted to think, and it's skipping it in, but intellectual, like patent rights and intellectual property type things, copyright and all that. It's kind of, you get this agreement that's negotiated, and then after that, you don't really get a say, So yeah, so that's where the controversy is. And I think it's going to be more clear when we move forward. So ownership of the corporation is not ownership of the firm. So corporation and the firm is two different things. We're going to tease out some more problems. So we talked about the widget maker already. So the widget maker is the owner, they can hire the workers to operate the widget maker, produce the widgets. They can lease the widget maker out to other parties that make widgets. Ownership is not the residual claimant. Depends on the direction of the hiring contracts. And regardless of whether and this kind of the thrust of this is, we kind of understand this as an individual. If you leased out something, let someone borrow your car to go and do Uber or whatever, I don't know, but you don't get to say, oh, that automatically, just ethically, I just automatically own all your stuff. There's gonna be a negotiation or whatever. All the profits or whatever. So individually, it's easier to understand. For some reason, for corporations, we kind of say, oh, no, it's harder to understand. But the argument here is it's the same thing. It's all based on contracts. So now let's talk about property rights. Right, property rights over the product, the residual claim, all this, the residuals, all that stuff. They're born, they can be transferred, they can be used, and then they can terminate. So during production, you have the old property rights of the inputs, right? So you have raw materials, you got corn, and you got the windmill, right? The corn's gonna get grinded up, right? So the property rights of the original corn get terminated, and then you've got maybe some waste or something, and then you have to remove it, and that's called negative appropriation. That's a liability. But the ground up corn, you have new property rights. Somebody's gonna own that stuff, and then that's an output, right? So you can output, you can exchange it, transfer to someone else. That's a property right transfer, and it can be consumed, right? The corn can get eaten, and then the property rights terminate. This is all the idea of property rights. One of the problems before with the concepts of talking about all this stuff is the appropriation of liabilities. So before we were to talk about this, I think one of the problems, I guess, with Karl Marx and some of the earlier ways of thinking about this stuff is they didn't include waste in their concept of property rights and liabilities and stuff like that. And so that was a big critique. But then, of course, production also has appropriation of assets. So one of the things is and what you can kind of see through intuition, whoever it is that sets things up or buy things and kind of have this intuition of risk, that kind of stuff. So they got to get this first time property right. So the person that bought the windmill, the person that set up the organization, took the loan out on the house or whatever, it seems like they because they're this risk taker or something like that, that they definitely have some property right over the asset, but it seems like there's something even more than that sometimes. And so that's what we're trying to tease out. Right. So production always has negative and positive things, as it's important for as far as critique. Now, property appropriation. We talked about this thought experiment already. Widget maker, you can lease or you can use the widget outright, right? So this is a machine. You can lease it for a time, you can use it outright. Then you've got labor services, you can hire them versus leasing out the widget maker, and you got widgets. All right, so the ownership of the widget maker, right? Ownership of the machine does not necessarily mean they are the appropriator of the product. Not even in our society right now is it the case that you're necessarily the appropriator of the product, the person who gets to be the one who says, I own. All right, so, let's go a little bit further into theory. We got theory of property. This is John Locke, traditional theory. Basically, our concept of property is the person that created the soup. They're the ones who get to say who can eat it, right? So you're the one that planted the corn. They're the ones who get to harvest it, right? There's some type of intuition is developed by John Locke, where it's kind of more of the person who takes the land and develops it, and then he also added on and closed it, so kind of paid attention to it. Not so much like a Johnny Appleseed going around and planting apples, planting apple trees, and then leaving them. He's kind of he doesn't have the right to those apple trees in this theory. But it's like if you planted them and you took care of them, you watered them, and you enclosed it in such a way saying then it's kind of yours. And that's the theory of property. That's kind of a big thrust or driver for some of these arguments. The person that works, they should have it's kind of a meritocracy type argument, or argument based on merit, right? You have your labor, you deserve the fruits of your labor. And I think that's good enough for this chapter. Do you have any questions? Or not chapter, but this piece. Let's go forward. We've got more to go. Labor theory of value or property. So this is only important because when you're talking about labor theory and you're talking about property and you're talking about value, there have been lots of people that have already talked about it. Karl Marx is one of them. And one of the, just, to skip over a bunch of things, one of the big mistakes that Karl Marx did was he had this theory of value that was critiqued all to hell. Right. And so what Ellerman does is tease out the parts that are kind of more rigorous or can be used, and then distances, himself and these arguments from the parts that are just can't be salvaged. So there's a labor theory of value, and then there's this labor theory of property that wasn't really developed by Karl Marx, but it was an intuition. Okay. Labor theory of value is talking about price theory, and it's talking about only the humans develop value. I mean, there's nothing else that develops value. And the critique of that, you've got entrepreneurs, you've got, assets and all these things, people taking risk, all that stuff that we kind of know intuitively now because of the society that we live in. So we don't really want to, he's like distancing that, talking about that. But the property part, labor is the source of the product. Now that is going to be some things that he is going to use. So is labor special? This is peculiar. Okay. So neoclassical arguments or economics. You've got two concepts of how labor operates in production, right? You've got capital as the agent of production, right? And you've got land plus capital. So that's capital assets and the owner of capital, entrepreneurs, that kind of thing. And you've got workers. And then you combine all those and then you got a product, right? This is the poetic view, right? Capital is made and used by humans. You've got the capital as a productive power, and it's the active cause of everything. And the humans, basically the labor, they're left out of the picture, and they're the passive servant. Okay, so this is the poetic view. And a critique is that it's called the pathetic fallacy. Here's a thought experiment. We've been talking about this already. Windmills, grind corn versus the creator and users of the windmill. So when you think of a tool, somebody will say, oh, windmills grind corn. And the response to that is actually the people who created the windmill and the people who use the windmill, that's what grinds the corn, right? The windmill is a tool. So you can say that you are, knocking in some nails with a hammer. You can say the hammer is what's doing knocking in the nails, or you can say you are the one that's knocking the nails. I guess the definition or the word that one critique is Karl Marx, he calls it animism. When you say that some tool is the thing that is doing the action, right? They're acting like the tool has intent and things like that. We're going to talk about that more later. So that's the thought experiment. That's the poetic view. The engineering view, you have human action, land, and capital, and that's causally efficacious, right? That does everything. There's nothing in between, right? All inputs, you take all the inputs, and then you combine them, and then you got the output, period. Labor is just another input. There's no active agent that uses the inputs, right? So this is saying there's labor, the workers, and all that. You're not special. And what we talked about before, and Taylor, what you're saying, right? And what we're saying before. Well, what about if? And here, come up with another scenario. What about if we did this negotiation agreement and the person that is the negotiator, the bargainer, they're the ones that somehow, because they did the bargaining, they're the ones that deserve the residual claimant role, and they deserve the profits and all that. It's really a contract. It's nothing but a contract. There's no ethical. That's where we're separating the prescriptive and the descriptive. We're separating the is and ought, right? And this concept here is really saying, and it is really saying, yeah, the worker, they just don't even exist. It's a subjectless production process. So humans and things are the same. The humans are no different than the windmill. That's those two views. That was poetic view, engineering view. Here's a humanistic view. It's not the neoclassical economic view, right? Humans use capital, humans use tools, humans produce the output, and humans are not symmetrical with tools and things. Humans are unique, right? So then you've got the radical economic view. This is going to be something from Karl Marx. This was a theory where it was kind of based off of labor power and labor time. I'm probably going to skip a little bit over this so we can move forward. But it's the basis, and there's a thought experiment here. But Ellerman is somewhat hostile to this concept, Karl Marx. It's because he uses it as a basis for exploitation theory, and but then there's the pushback from conventional economics that there's no difference between labor and tools, and he calls it a spectacular failure. It did not succeed as a theory, right? Because it's basically trying to tease out a difference between labor power and labor time. And use an example. You got car power and like if you want to rent a car, you got car power, right? So you rented a car for a day. Well, you have the ability to do something with the car for a day. You can just sit there parked, or you can drive it 100 miles an hour, right? Then you got car time, which is a piece rate, which is, oh, you went 500 miles, the rental company is going to say, here's a little bit extra charge we're going to do to you because you were driving it, right? So it's really both of these things need to be accounted for, even for point of this being, even for tools, even for inanimate objects and not labor. And so this was kind of a pushback against saying that labor power, labor time is something special. Power and time are also on tools. So that was the argument, and it's not useful. Here's another, here's a thought experiment also that's used by Karl Marx. So you have a spider, and it's like a human weaver, someone making clothes, right? What's the difference between a spider and a human, right? The spider doesn't build things in its mind before construction, right? It doesn't have an ideal and all that. So only humans do this. Karl Marx says, I can see the humans are special, right? And so there's kind of a underlying driver there for saying that the real argument is that because there's conscious direction and purposefulness, Karl Marx kind of connected that to the labor theory of value. But Ellerman is saying he didn't develop the labor theory of property, and now we've got a problem. So that is doing some homework there. Any questions? We've got a couple more, and I'm going to try to, we've got maybe 20 more minutes or so. I'm going to try to go ahead. So Karl Marx had no concept of responsibility or intentionality, right? So this is important for this chapter, this whole chapter, this idea of responsibility. So Ellerman makes this argument that economics is basically got physics enemy. It's basically trying to be a natural science. And one of the things that fails is there's something going on that's unaccounted for, and it's responsibility. And you can tease that out if you look at law. Law talks about responsibility, has a whole theory about responsibility. And it says only human agents can be responsible for things. So you have this paradox within economics where they try to look at it as a natural science. They try to combine a bunch of things. And they were at the end, oh, what popped out is the product. Don't worry about it. And it's really gratuitous. And so that's really the thrust of it. So we're going to use law. We're going to use the argument of responsibility and say you can't be a cherry picker and say humans got responsibility here, but not over here. That would be a fallacy. So, but Karl Marx didn't do that. He was almost there, but he didn't really quite get there. He talked about labor responsibility. So law talks about labor responsibility, and non-persons can't be responsible. Can't have, I hate, we kind of don't like saying, guns don't kill people, but people kill people. But it's true. You don't put a gun in prison, right? You put a person in prison that uses the weapon. So that's really where law comes in, right? So instruments are the means of production, right? Tools, but they're not responsible for production. Keyword, responsible. So let's see here. We've got a thought experiment. This should make it very clear. You have burglary tools, so lock picking equipment or whatever. You've got the actual burglar. This is like the labor person, right? So burglary tools, that's capital. That's the capital asset. Burglar, that's the labor. They're going to be responsible for the burglary. Well, I'm skipping forward. Then you've got the actual burglary, right? So that's the corn being ground up, right? And then that's the product, right? The burglar is responsible for the burglary. We don't say that the person that commissioned the burglar is solely responsible and the burglar doesn't get anything. No, the key word is impute within law. No, that burglar is going to get it. They're going to jail. Doesn't matter. Someone else can also be a part of it, but the burglar isn't. And there's no employment contract. There's nothing that can stop them, right? So people are uniquely responsible agents, and they're the conductors of tools. So does anyone have any questions about that? This is the thrust of the argument here of we shouldn't be thinking that the person that sets everything up, we're going to talk about entrepreneurs here in a bit, that sets everything up, they are the one, they took the risk, they took the whatever, it doesn't matter. Like so let's say someone else takes the risk and then they commission the burglar. They take some big risk. Like you watch a film where the person that goes and gets the plans for the bank or the casino, right? They go get the plans and they've been working on it for 5 years and all this stuff like that. And then they turned around and gave them to the burglar, and the burglar goes in. Well, the first person, like they set it all up. They're the ones, they had the initial risk and all that stuff. So when it's time for someone to go to prison, they go to prison. But the person that goes in and does the robbing of the casino or the bank or whatever, they also go to prison. They don't get to like, I transferred all my responsibility over to the person that's it. They don't get to do that. So this argument is saying that that responsibility is an inalienable thing. You can't transfer it. As far as a natural right, you can't do it. We're talking about ethics, right? Not contract, not or anything like that. Not law. We're talking about ethics when I'm talking about that side. And then law tries to capture that and say, oh yeah, this is obviously true. Does this not seem obvious to people? Okay.
It does when you're going this way. Of course, so I definitely want to see where it ties when we have when you go further into the, how far does it go? When does someone get to decide? But that's contract and not ethics, I guess, is what it comes down to. So how far is it okay? When is it not okay? If someone says, just give me 10%, I get 10%, so that's part of it. But on this end, when you're doing it, it makes a lot of sense. The burglar and someone that's masterminding, but they never went in. So they both go to jail. So what on that side, the something that came to my mind is, what about a soldier and the military following commands and the ethics involved in that?
Oh, well, I can give you that. You can't follow any unlawful commands. I can tell you that right now. So somebody tells you to go kill some civilians, you can't do it.
Right. So if it's lawful, so
yeah, you're still responsible, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, you don't get to say, the commanding officers told me to just shoot these babies. No, you're going to jail.
So that's about if the laws have ethics or follow, if we're, presuming that there's these morals and ethics that should be involved. Then that's great. But if the laws are like, no, it's totally fine, it's legal, it's fine to shoot.
Yeah, no, that's in the last chapter. And so the basic argument is that the law actually is invalid and that employment contracts are invalid. That's the controversial end of where we're going. They're invalid. Employment contracts are invalid. You shouldn't be able to hire people, is what he's saying. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. All right.
Keep going.
So natural sciences, no concept of responsibility in the natural sciences. This is shocking to me. Like, I didn't realize this, but I like having a very simple concept that is unaccounted for in the hard sciences. That is very important. Responsibility. There's no accounting of it. You can't do it, right? You have causality. You can have a whole bunch of a chain of events, but responsibility is not causality, and it's not something that you can ignore. It's very important, right? For crime, right? So, natural sciences, engineering description, economics, it loves it, right? Persons and tools, same thing. No distinction, right? Capitalist economics does not recognize any unique characteristics of labor, tries to put them all together. It's an ideological blind spot. And there we go. So let's go to this next one. You're getting into law, right? The juridical principle of imputation is the same thing with some small modifications of as the labor theory of property. So this is really that we're getting at the crux of the argument of this chapter. You got some history. You've got Ricardo. This is one of the early economists. You didn't really need to talk about him, but basically he had, some of the early labor theories of property, labor claim to the whole product, so on and so forth. Let's skip here. So we're going to have to separate de facto versus de jure, right? So de facto is in fact, it's the descriptive portion. And de jure is odd for property and in law, because you have to figure out the de facto first. And then de jure is when you say, okay, you figured it out. Okay, now we're going to do something about it. But it's based on that, right? So de facto responsible, right? A person within law, the only way they can be responsible is if they had some intention. The first thing that someone will kind of say is, well, someone could get in trouble even if they were careless, so they didn't have intention. No, being careless is also an intention. So if you go out, you do your drunk driving, you do whatever, and you're being careless and you kill someone, careless is an intention too. So it accounts for that, right? And so you've got de jure, legal responsibility. That is the imputation of criminal responsibility and of the intended act, right? So you have the juridical principle of imputation. It's always in accordance with a de facto responsibility. This is a big setup to say this, since we do it over here, it's special pleading. You're cherry picking if you don't do it when you're in economics. You know the humans work this way, and your life is not livable if you don't do this. Your system has to have some way of dealing with crime in order to have a society. And we're cherry picking when we don't say, oh yeah, the humans are responsible over here, but they're not over here. It's really where this is going. So this assignment of property rights, with the juridical principle of imputation and the labor theory of property, people appropriate the negative and positive fruits of the labor, right? So fruits of labor is a comparison within economics. Intentional actions is corresponding counterpart in law. You can think of, so de facto responsibility, when using these terms normative and prescriptive. De facto responsibility is not normative and prescriptive, same thing. It's not normative, right? So you have a jury system. They're the ones determining if something is de jure, but they're doing it in a de facto way. They're looking at facts, right? And then the responsibility is imputed. That's how that works, right? So economists, it's like they're on jury duty. They're going around looking at facts, right? But they're trying not to make any value judgments, right? Seems absolutely fine, except for responsibility is a value judgment. You have to do something with responsibility. Only humans can have it, right? So tools can't be responsible. Humans, they should be responsible, and that's missed by economics. The theory of trying to deal with all of this stuff is called marginal productivity theory, created by a guy named Weiser. He actually looked at responsibility and was seeing that only humans can be responsible for something, has quotes. So the author, Ellerman, is saying, this is the only person I can find that uses the term responsibility. That's an economist. In old texts and new texts and all that stuff. And he just turned around and ignored it and said, yep, it just doesn't apply. Doesn't apply to not relevant in capitalist appropriation. Right? And the argument is that this is a thing that you'll see if you read economics a bunch. All stable socioeconomic systems have conditions for their own reproduction built in. Basically, the status quo, all of the humans that are within the system, they're just going to say, I'm used to the status quo. Did you have something different? Oh, it's kind of an ethical difference or whatever. Well, if it doesn't work with the status quo of the system, then it's invalid because it's either impractical or it must be immoral because our system is the best, right? So that kind of thing. And he's saying that that's why it was ignored. And he's saying that the word responsibility is just all around forbidden in economics. Haven't read a bunch of, game theory. I don't remember seeing the word responsibility in there at all, really. So, I think it's true. Any questions? All right. What is labor's product? We're at 8:20. Let's try to get done in 10 minutes. Let's see. We really need to go over this. This is, we don't need to. Let's skip this one. Entrepreneurship. This is our favorite, right? The entrepreneur is the one that sets up a productive organization, right? The entrepreneur has kind of a special nature, right? But the argument is that they're not special. They shouldn't be considered special. They can have a larger contribution, but they are in the same category as the humans, the other workers. So they don't really change less creative forms of human activity, so workers, into products. It isn't Steve Jobs is the best and all the other people they should just have wages, and Steve Jobs is the one, because they are exempt. They are the entrepreneur and they should be exempt. It isn't the case. The argument here is that that's not the case. It shouldn't be the case. So with the entrepreneur concept and ideology, the humans are hired and rented. And within capital ideology, the entrepreneur is exempt, right? So when I say exempt, so we already said all this whole time, and I want to get into this here because I think this is one of the most important parts. This red here. But entrepreneurs is exempt. We have the humans, and we already said you don't get we normally say, yeah, you're hired, you don't get any say, you don't have the residual claimant role, you don't get any say on profit, whatever. I took all the risks or whatever, right? So you didn't get a say. But we're saying that that's the humans. They don't get a say, but the entrepreneur is a human. So it's like, oh, okay, well, they're exempt. They don't become a tool or thing, right? They retain their responsibility. And so what you have is two sets of people. You've got one set and they're the creative and the responsible. And you got the other set and they're a tool or thing-like. So this is, Ellerman says, is going to be a dangerous setup, right? He's saying that when societies have two sets of people, bad things happen. Now, within economics, there's a school called the Chicago School. This is what you kind of get it through intuition and just, our language in the United States. You have risk takers and risk averters, right? Or people who are risk averse. And that's Chicago School, right? Those are two sets of people. Austrian School, same kind of thing. You have the risk takers, they're like the supermen. And then you have the lesser humans. Same concept, right? So this is two sets of people. One of the things that Ellerman is really hard on Marx because he left too much on the table for a critique of capital. So there are a bunch of contradictions within capitalistic economics, that they're internal contradictions, right? So we associate, right, and their principles, capitalistic principles that we associate with capital, but it violates its own principles. So you have capitalism and private property. We just finished talking about if someone plants the corn and they enclose it and they do all this other stuff, they should have the fruits of their labor. That there's something fundamentally wrong where, okay, we have on one side, we have the fruits of the labor, and we have, and the person that actually helped create or did all of this. And then on the other side, no, you don't get to have the fruits of their labor. And that's the best foundation that we have for property, is people who or do the work, they should enjoy the fruits of their labor. So capitalism and private property are actually, you know, not they kind of have a internal contradiction. And then you have capitalism and democracy. So you go into Thomas Hobbes. It's the kind of the concept of who's going over this really quick, but his view is that when people get together, there's the social contract. So Thomas Hobbes is a social contract guy, like their original social contract guy. And the only way for there not to be any, chaos and everyone, the laws of the jungle, is that there has to be, in some form, an anti-democratic situation. So there's a pact of subjugation, and the people, they alienate their rights for self-governance, really alienating their right in order to do harm to their neighbor, right? And you give that to the government. That's Hobbes. Now there's critiques of Hobbes. We're saying, hold on now, we want to, that's anti-democratic, we want to be democratic. So that's the next group of the Enlightenment philosophers and so on and so forth, ethicists and stuff. They're like, okay, we want democratic forms and things like that. Employers are not the delegate of the employees, so it's anti-democratic. So capitalism and democracy are absolutely not. Like capitalism is basically a dictatorship. And then you've got capitalism and entrepreneurship. Okay, well, that should be good with each other, right? But entrepreneurs can be a form of labor too. Entrepreneur is not necessarily capital. So we've got this thought experiment, right? So entrepreneur versus venture capital. So entrepreneur comes in and says, all right, I created the organization. I set up the labor contracts, like what Taylor was saying earlier. I set up the 90%. And so a royalty contract with you and all that. Well, guess what? The venture capital, the ones that own the stock, the ones that gave money in the first place, they're like, oh, you got 90%. That's our 90%. And so now you have the entrepreneur as not really exempt from being having their work appropriated. So they're not a special case. They also can be appropriated. So that whole thing of saying that there's something special about the risk taker and like this, you can sit around and take a bunch of risks about like planning, setting up an org, work 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, and then turn around, it's like, I gotta borrow this money. And the only way for me to do it is for me to give up this stock and all that. And guess what? Doesn't matter. You ate all that. And then now it's funny within the ideology, what do we turn around and say? Well, I guess you were just stupid for doing all that. You were the risk taker, but you were just, you made some dumb risks. So, oh, well, you deserve to have all that. That's how we think in our society. It's not, we'll just say, oh, risk takers deserve it. Oh, but they took risks. Well, I guess they don't. But then, no, we're throwing that out the window. Now they're just dumb. Right? So that's how ideology works. Right? So those are three internal contradictions. Let's blast through this here. Here's another example. Right? I think that this one is good. Right? Political revolutionaries. Somebody like George Washington. Right? It's like the entrepreneurial role. They set up the country. They set up a nation. They're the ones, they even were risking their lives. They were taking risks, all of that stuff. Do they get to become the king? They could. They could have the power. Maybe it could work. Just because you have the power, should they? Right? And so the thrust of there's plenty of arguments against that, like as far as self-determination of people and all that. That's democratic theory. But we don't think that there is some kind of right to essentially residual claimant role of a geography or a nation or something like that because you were the one that set it up, right? So that's political revolutionaries. Yeah, and then there's one more thought experiment, and we'll get through this. So someone might say, so if you have the democratic firm and you go ahead and like what we were talking about earlier, Taylor, with the royalty payments, you could set it up, right? We have to figure out some way, some new way to recognize entrepreneurs, period, right? It doesn't just because, like, so we're coming up here to democratic firm. Not everybody, just because it's a democratic firm, this is a, you know, I guess a myth. Not everyone's work is of equal value. The entrepreneur, they often are the most important. They're setting everything up and because they maybe, like we say, they're taking a risk and all that. But you need to address it. And we don't, like, same way that we don't address it with, like, we don't say someone that sets up a nation automatically becomes a king. We shouldn't set up the entrepreneur automatically, they become a king as well, or the residual claimant. So we need to do something along the lines of, we know that their contributions are like intellectual property and they're doing a lot of org structuring and these types of things. We need some way to recognize them, right? And then the traditional capital economics, their recognition is captured as ownership. So the democratic firm, we want to do something different. So maybe royalty payments is what we said before, you know, on each product. And so that would be weird if it was like 90% or 100%, then that defeats the purpose. So here's a thought experiment, right? Someone, when the pushback is, well, entrepreneurs not giving us the same amount as if they were the owner. So there's obviously something broken, right? They're the chosen ones. They took they took the risk and all that. They should have the biggest reward. They have that. They don't get the same wealth if they're leaving too much on the table if they do this democratic firm thing. Well, so what? Political revolutionaries, they don't get the same wealth as a king. So that's where it's kind of a special pleading situation. And that is this one. Does anybody have any questions?
Do you want to pause here and we do a second part to continue on?
Yeah, it seems about right. I think,
Ooh, yeah, when you pop that open, look at all
yeah.
that.
Yeah, we got too much going on here. That one could have been skipped. We talked about the internal contradictions. We already told you about all the inalienable rights and all this stuff like that. But basically, the only thing that's left is that these comparisons between the final thing is basically real quick. When people will compare, so the argument is that you basically hiring people, it shouldn't be legal. That's the controversial thing that he's saying. So we should fight against that or make it to where it's, disincentives for it or whatever. But someone will, the thing is that, well, if you volunteered for this employer-employee relationship, if you volunteered for it, so that's consent, then it's gotta be fine, right? But we have a whole history of you cannot, just because you volunteer as for ownership for your body, you can volunteer to become a slave, basically, indentured servitude. And that's illegal also. And so you can't, that's an inalienable thing. You cannot, when it's inalienable, you cannot decide to volunteer to do it. And so so that would be part of anti-slavery thought and stuff. Here's some things. Here's some final things here. Marketplace bargaining power should not control ownerships of humans. So that's slavery. And hiring of humans. So instead of 100% of your hours, the marketplace of bargaining power shouldn't own 8 hours of your time per day. So that's kind of trying to put it concisely. People should rent or own capital. Capital should not rent or own people. So flipping that on its head, right? Capital is not the residual claimant role, doesn't automatically have that. We've seen that. And the acts of humans are the same. They're always responsible for crimes, not tools. So they should always be responsible for work as well, right? And get the fruits of their labor and all that. So that would be the end.